All right, hello everyone, and welcome to this discussion with Ken Masterson Brown. My name is Cameron Sauers, and I am a senior at Gettysburg College, and I'm also a fellow at the Civil War Institute at Gettysburg College. Today, I'm very excited to be joined by Ken Masterson Brown to talk about his upcoming book called Meade at Gettysburg, A Study in Command, which is going to be coming out this summer from the University of North Carolina Press. Ken is an award-winning filmmaker, attorney, and historian. He's published numerous books, including Cushing of Gettysburg, the story of a Union artillery commander, as well as Retreat from Gettysburg, Lee Logistics, and the Pennsylvania Campaign. Additionally, Ken is also the president of the Witnessing History Education Foundation, which produces high-quality documentary films for public and cable television. Ken, first, thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate you taking the time to sit down with me.
It's my pleasure, Cameron. Thank you for having me.
So my first question is going to be about Meade before he takes command of the Army of the Potomac. I'm wondering if you could talk about Meade and his performances before he gets command and how those contribute to why he's offered command as opposed to anyone else from the Army of the Potomac or an outside option.
Yeah, Meade is named a brigadier general of volunteers early in the war, in the early fall of 1861. And his first assignment to command is a brigade in the Pennsylvania Reserves. And Meade steadily moves up the ladder within the Pennsylvania Reserves, as does another newly minted brigadier general named John Fulton Reynolds. The two of them basically served together the entire first 2+ years of the war. And ultimately, he is named commander of the 5th Corps in the Army of the Potomac and elevated to the rank of Major General. And this is in the late fall and early winter of 1862-63. And he commands the 5th Corps at Chancellorsville. Up to this point in time, Meade has been shown to be a very capable tactical commander. And on the eve of Gettysburg, while the army is in Frederick, after General Joseph Hooker had taken that army from Falmouth, Virginia, north all the way to Frederick, on June 28, 1863, George Meade is named commander of the Army of the Potomac. And now he is the operational commander of the Army of the Potomac, and quite a step away from being a tactical commander of a corps. I actually think that the choice of George Meade by Lincoln, Stanton, the War Department, General Halleck, who was the equivalent of today's chief of staff of the Army, was based upon his abilities as a tactical commander, which were solid. I think that's the best way to put it. They were solid. His performance was solid. The question that arose, frankly, among that group in the War Department and the White House was, in fact, whether they wanted to change commanders at all, because there was a heavy lobby for Joe Hooker to stay. Joe Hooker was well-placed politically.
Yeah.
And even though his performance at Chancellorsville was anything but stellar, there was still this lingering doubt about whether we should change commanders. And this seemed to be evident in Lincoln himself. Nevertheless, they dallied. This crowd dallied until, frankly, June 27, when Joe Hooker began making an issue out of he not being able to take the command at Harper's Ferry, the garrison at Harper's Ferry, and bring it within the Army of the Potomac. And back on January 31st of 1863, the War Department had issued him orders that you are not to do anything with the garrison at Harper's Ferry. You are to protect it, keep it there, as well as always protect the city of Washington. And so they were adamant about that. And it became a flashpoint where Hooker demanded he get it, or he would just simply resign from the Army, which he did. And so on June 27, they get his letter of resignation because they won't give in to him. And by now, Robert E. Lee's army is some of it is still in the Cumberland Valley at Chambersburg, but the rest of them are scattered all over east of Gettysburg, all the way to York. Some of them are north of Gettysburg. I mean, Lee's army has really made progress, and here they are still dallying about who's the commander. And so kind of at the last moment, George Meade became the commander of the Army of the Potomac and was notified of it at about 3 o'clock in the morning of June 28.
Yeah, that story just is such a great connection for me because my first job as a public historian was at Harper's Ferry.
Really?
Yeah, and most recently I was at Chancellorsville. So I've talked, a lot about Joe Hooker, and I lived right off the first day's battlefield here in Gettysburg. And it always blows my mind, no matter how many times we talk about the lead up to the campaign, just how quickly it seems like everything is happening at the end of June. That George Meade is in command for just a few days at the start of the battle, which brings me to my next question. For all the times I've gone through the first day's battlefield, it's very much a place where we talk about John Reynolds, we talk about O.O. Howard and Winfield Scott Hancock. But behind the scenes, someone we don't talk about when we're out on the ground on the first day is George Meade, but he's in command. So I'm wondering if you could talk about what he's doing on July 1st and how he gets the army to Gettysburg.
Okay. He moves the army north on June 29 out of Frederick. He gets them as far as just below, frankly, the Pipe Creek line, Big Pipe Creek. His headquarters are at Middleburg, Maryland on that night. The next day, he moves his headquarters to Taneytown. And this is June 30. And on June 30, he apparently had a personal conference with Reynolds. We do have one surviving communication between George Meade and John Reynolds that is of critical importance to what your question is. And I found that letter in an envelope in the National Archives in the 11th Corps papers. And that it was in an envelope, and this envelope reads on the front, papers taken from the pockets of Major General John F. Reynolds, July 1, 1863. These are letters taken from his pockets when he was killed. And one of the letters in there is entirely in the handwriting of General Meade. And General Meade tells him that, and this is to accompany, by the way, orders that Meade has also given to him, and that is to move the First Corps to Gettysburg. Now, the letter now further emphasizes what Meade wants to do on July 1 when he gets to Gettysburg. He tells General Reynolds to get his corps on the roads and routes of communications of the enemy. Now, the purpose of getting on the roads and routes of communications with the enemy is, of course, to cause the enemy to collect in front of you, which they hope that they will, and any enemy would, by the way. And the roads and routes of communication are nothing more than the pike between Chambersburg, Gettysburg, and York. And I refer to it in my book as the turnpike axis. It's where all along it on either side are all the elements of Lee's army, either slightly north of it or on that turnpike. And so if he gets his corps on the roads and routes of communication, what is Meade expecting him to do? Meade says that if the enemy confronts you and begins to press you, I want you to fall back to Emmitsburg. That's 10 miles. Now, what kind of an operation is that? Some people would refer to this simply as a reconnaissance in force. The military theorists like Dennis Hart Mahan at West Point, who was Meade's teacher, he was John Reynolds' teacher of military tactics and the art of war. He wrote a book about this operation, this kind of operation. And it's the operational use of an advanced corps. You take a good 1/5 to 1/7 of your army and you move them north ahead of the rest of your force. The purpose being to cause the enemy to collect in front of you. Once you cause the enemy to collect in front of you, then you begin a withdrawal. Now, it could be a fighting withdrawal, but it's a withdrawal.
Right.
And as on each step of the withdrawal, then you, as the commander of that advanced force, keep the commander of the army notified of who's in front of you and what is happening. Now, you ask, why would Meade want to do this? Well, the problem that Meade faced on June 30 was he did not know the full positions of all of Lee's corps or divisions. The reports were contradictory. Some of them never changed. And he had to know something about the whereabouts of that enemy. And believe me, there's no better way to find out the whereabouts of an enemy than to cause him to collect all his forces in front of you.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. They're all right there. And that's the purpose of that. So it's a reconnaissance, but it's a reconnaissance that forces the enemy to react. Then you report what's happening in front of you. And I mean, this sort of operation is as old as Karl von Clausewitz. He had his own operational use of an advanced corps. So did Jomini.
Yeah.
And so Dennis Hart Mahan was a disciple of both of those. And so that's what the purpose of Reynolds' operation is. The problem, though, and this poses a problem for me through the entire rest of the campaign, is that Reynolds goes forward first with one division ahead of the remaining two that are more than an hour behind. Mm-hmm. And with that one division, he simply goes to the aid of John Buford, who's caught in a fight west of town. With this one division, he's facing Harry Heath's Confederate division in A.P. Hill's Corps. And with this one division, he tries to help Buford. And in the process, John Reynolds is killed. The remaining two divisions come up, as does the 11th Corps, which was designed by, told by George Meade to move to the support of Reynolds. And O.O. Howard, who commands the 11th Corps, told Reynolds and Meade that he would hold his corps at the Wentz's place. Now, those people who love Gettysburg know where the Wentz's place is. It's right on the Emmitsburg Road at the Peach Orchard. Mm-hmm. And you go, why is he going to hold his corps there? You're almost 1.5 miles, 2 miles behind Reynolds. The purpose is to allow Reynolds to fall back upon him, because that's what the whole scheme of this is. Fall back, keep falling back, then you can fall back upon the entire 11th Corps, then fall back to the left flank of the Army of the Potomac. And the problem with it is that because of the errors made on the first day's field, the First Corps brings up, now Doubleday is in command of the First Corps, brings up the 11th Corps. They're poorly placed. And as a result of that, to make a long story short, both the 11th and First Corps are routed. Yeah. And they flee back to Cemetery Hill and Culp's Hill. And at the end of this day, Meade is faced with the proposition of having to move the entire army to Gettysburg, which he does. And the tough thing there is that all this time Meade has set up his own supply base at Westminster, which is 7 miles behind the Pipe Creek line. But sadly, it's 22 miles southeast of Gettysburg. And to get there, you use the Baltimore Pike, and the Baltimore Pike is threatened by an entire corps of Lee's army the entire time Meade is there. So it's ceased to be used. They can't use the Baltimore Pike. Consequently, the army suffers for lack of forage, lack of subsistence stores, everything.
So my next question is about the source material for your book. And I was interested to hear you found this Reynolds letter
Yes.
in the 11th Corps folders, which I think is like
Right.
kind of every historian's like our hope when we're in the archives is what we know that these are the letters pulled off of John Reynolds, and Gettysburg is no doubt about it one of the most written about parts of the Civil War. There's been no shortage of everything down from broad histories of the campaign to focuses on specific units or geographical features.
Right.
As you researched and wrote this book, was there a particular source you found yourself relying on that you didn't expect when you undertook this project, or was there one that changed your insight or your perspective?
Yes, in this sense, and I won't say this necessarily was found in the research for this book.
Okay.
But it was an offshoot of what I found researching the book Retreat from Gettysburg. And that was the papers of the Quartermaster General of the United States Army. There, I remember finding a report issued at the end of the war by the Deputy Quartermaster General about the Gettysburg campaign. And here he was talking about the supply deficiencies in the Army of the Potomac and what happened as a result of supply deficiencies. But now he didn't go into the use of Westminster or not, or the Baltimore Pike, any of that. He just explained there were serious supply deficiencies. Subsequently, researching this book, and going through all the papers of all the various Army Corps in the Army of the Potomac, I came across again in the 11th Corps papers a whole cache of correspondence between General Howard's chief of staff in the 11th Corps and the quartermaster of the 11th Corps and the deputy quartermaster who was assigned to Westminster, which he called the Camp of Transportation. That became the name of Westminster, the Camp of Transportation, because parked there were all the wagon trains of all 7 of the Corps and the Cavalry Corps, plus the Artillery Reserve. And that group of wagons, if you stretched them out on one road, would be more than 50 miles long. That's how many wagons were back there. And that would mean, thousands of horses and mules. And they parked them all there because that's where Meade set up the supply depot when he had the Pipe Creek line in mind. And so now the question is, with this quartermaster of the 11th Corps, how do I get supplies to my troops, and particularly my horses and mules? A horse and a mule has to be fed every day. And in the Army regs, they have to be fed 14 pounds of oats and 14 pounds of hay every day, each one. Now imagine that job with an army of 92,000 troops and more than 60,000 horses and mules. How do you feed all this?
Yeah.
And anytime you have any sort of delay in getting that there, it's virtually catastrophic. And so what I found in the 11th Corps papers were all this correspondence between this deputy quartermaster and the chief of staff under General O.O. Howard talking about how difficult it is to get the supplies up to Gettysburg.
Interesting. Okay.
And they'd say the quartermaster here, who was a professional quartermaster, Army quartermaster for many years, who headed up the camp of transportation at Westminster, went to him and said, look, I'm doing everything I can do to get the supplies here, meaning at Westminster. Mm-hmm. As soon as they're here, I'll distribute them. I'll distribute them as fast as I can. But he couldn't get the supplies there. And then naturally, they couldn't get them up the road. And when they did get them there, the next letter I read was, all of them went to the 5th Corps. They didn't go here. We didn't get anything. You can just imagine the lineup. Yeah. It must have been nothing short of a nightmare. Getting what's needed to that supply base and then getting that stuff up to the Army of the Potomac. And frankly, by July 4th, the Army had just not been fed. Mm-hmm. And those horses and mules had not been fed. And the horse and mule will break down. And I imagine, I say in the book, that the officers and men, handling the horses in artillery batteries and what wagons they had up at the front could look at those horses and say, you won't make it another 3 days.
Yeah.
You just won't make it. They're weak, and a horse gets weak, and then it collapses. Yeah. And by the time Meade gets that army to the Potomac River to confront Lee, get this, he will have lost 14,000 horses.
Wow.
And one diarist I found, a Pennsylvania unit, was saying the horses are all, quote, blue, and hundreds are dying every day. This is the 12th of July.
Yeah.
What I did say, there are historians I take issue with in this book. One of them, of course, is Edmund Coddington about the way the first day evolved. Mm-hmm. But what I do say with Ed Coddington writes at the very end of his book, the Gettysburg Campaign, that Meade had to have faced the fact that the Army of the Potomac was not the instrument that he could have used to do really much of anything because of its shape. Mm-hmm. So even Coddington, having never reviewed all these sort of quartermaster records that I know of, could sense that the Army was simply not the same instrument it was.
Yeah.
And it had worn itself down.
Yeah. I don't know, I think that's going to be interesting. I mean, I look forward to being able to really read that and dive into, your footnotes and stuff, because I think that's really going to change the way we think about Gettysburg and, this massive conversation that's been happening for decades among historians about Gettysburg. To think that you're building and, finding places to push back and to reaffirm Coddington is really interesting, because his study is one that's, still a go-to source for Gettysburg. So
it is
to find these continued ways we can complicate our understandings of what's being faced and what the Army of the Potomac's dealing with here is interesting.
Yeah. It's the story, just like with my retreat book, it's the story of logistics. You in order for an army to stay in the field, you have to keep it supplied. You have to keep its horses fed in the 19th century. In the 20th century, you had to keep the fuel coming.
Yeah.
George Patton understands what it's like when his army runs out of fuel.
Yeah.
It's dead. The army's dead. And it's there for the picking as far as the enemy is concerned. So you've got to keep all that up. And Meade works overtime trying to get all of that to his troops. Interestingly, to show you how bad the army was, even at Frederick, By the time the army Meade gets to Taneytown, his quartermaster will have ordered for that army 50,000 pair of shoes. The army's barefoot. And by the time those troops get to the Potomac River, O.O. Howard will write that one half of his men have no shoes. Most of his horses can't make it over Turner Pass. I mean, really, really tough shape. Really tough shape. And the difference, interestingly, between him, people say, well, what about Lee? Those guys, they even campaigned more. They foraged the entire time. Yeah. Lee's army had been fed, meagerly, but fed. Its horses had been fed, again, meagerly, but enough. Meade's had nothing, just nothing.
So my next question for you is one that's inspired by a recent weekend rewatching of the movie Gettysburg. Like all great research that's done here, when you're a student at Gettysburg College, that becomes your language. But it got me thinking about Meade because of one of my favorite scenes in the movie. And I'm curious to hear your assessment of the way this happens in real life. And that is the Council of War and Meade's relationship with his subordinates at Gettysburg. I'm curious what that tells us about his command at Gettysburg.
Okay. There are lots of councils of war in this campaign. Mm-hmm. In fact, the Battle of Gettysburg on July 2nd opens with Meade in council of war with all his corps commanders. It is on the afternoon of July 2nd. The only one absent from that council of war is Sickles, General Sickles. He had been ordered to show up twice and did not respond. And instead, General Warren, who is Meade's chief engineer, arrives with the news that Sickles has moved his corps up to the Emmitsburg Road. And this is what starts this horrid scene, yet another crisis for George Meade. Mm-hmm. But that council was called because all these corps commanders and their corps had been on the march all day, yes, the previous day, and for purposes of the 5th and 6th Corps, July 2nd as well. And the 6th Corps wouldn't arrive until late that afternoon, having marched 33 miles from Manchester. A grueling march. And all that called for all the corps commanders to get together, which they did. It was interrupted by gunfire, which announced the beginning of the fighting on the second day. That evening, after the fighting was over on July 2nd, there was another council of war. This is the one that's drawn all the criticism over the years. Yet, in order to win the victory on the 2nd of July, George Meade, who actually became the tactical commander on the battlefield on the Union left, fighting the Confederate attacks from James Longstreet's corps, that Meade, in being tactical commander, had brought up no fewer than 5 different divisions of various corps in the Army in order to stop that attack. So you wound up having Army divisions, divisions of various corps scattered all over the battlefield. Now, if that alone doesn't call for a council of war among all your commanders, I don't know what does. One, you have to figure out where everybody is. And you have to figure out the situation, casualties, et cetera, of each one of those commands, so as to make an assessment about what we do, about who needs to go where. It's as right as rain, absolutely right as rain. And But he's been criticized with that. Some claiming that he was trying to get the Corps commanders to agree with him to leave Gettysburg. My friend Alan Gelzo, who I like very, very much, says that. And yet, this is not so. In fact, George Meade, before that council begins, he writes a letter to Henry Halleck, telling Henry Halleck, this is at 8 o'clock, council doesn't begin for another hour. At 8 o'clock, he tells Henry Halleck, I plan to stay at Gettysburg in my present position. Pow, I mean, that's it.
Yeah.
He never gets to mail that letter, send it by, and by the way, this is another interesting thing. People never ask, how does Meade communicate with the War Department?
Yeah.
There are no telegraphs there, at least that would get him there. And the Western Maryland Railroad at Westminster had no telegraph wires at all. So how does he get it? Well, there were relays set up, like Pony Express relays up and down the Baltimore Pike. It would take 6 hours for a message to get by relay rider, a relay every 7 miles, and a new rider, a new horse every 7 miles. It would take 6 hours to get a message to Baltimore, and there they would telegraph it. But the problem with it is that at 8 o'clock, who was attacking Culp's Hill? Well, it was Dick Ewell's Corps.
Yeah.
Confederate attacks against Culp's Hill. So there are no riders going down the Baltimore Pike. You can't send important dispatches down there for fear they're going to be captured, right?
Yeah,
so it's not only food and supplies, it's communications are shut down. So he finally gets it sent after 11 o'clock at night, saying he's going to stay right where he is. So I don't know what else one needs to say about Meade's intentions that night. He said it. And you add up all the things Meade did, all the orders he gave up to that point in time, and there's no way you can rationally conclude that he'd had anything else in mind other than to stay right there.
Yeah.
Now, Meade calls yet another council of war, and this is on July 4. And this is down along the Baltimore Pike at his makeshift headquarters. A driving rain, they couldn't meet in the tent, so they go to a house down there near Rock Creek, and they have another council of war. And the purpose there is Meade wants to get the ideas of all the commanders about how to pursue Lee. Now, Meade has already written to 2 commanders in Darius Couch's department of the Susquehanna in Harrisburg, telling them if he pursues Lee, if he has to pursue Lee, which he believes he's going to have to. Right now, Lee is stationary behind embattlements on Seminary Ridge. But he writes these 2 saying that if I have to pursue Lee, I'm going to pursue on his flank to Emmitsburg and Middletown. That means you're not going to directly follow the enemy through the mountains. Nobody would. I mean, every military theorist in history has said you don't do that. Rather, you pursue on his flank with the idea of making as much speed as you can and then confronting him at a spot where you believe he's going to have to stop. And he believed then Lee would have to stop at the Potomac. 1, it was swollen. And 2, he knew there were no bridges across it for him. Their bridge had been destroyed by roving Union cavalry out of Frederick. So he's going to move on Lee's flank. So Meade already knew what he wanted to do. He never told, just like at the evening of July 2nd, Meade never told the men there he had sent an order or a message to Halleck saying, I'm staying right here. Instead, he asked him, what do you want to do? Knowing, believe me, knowing they would all say, stay right here.
Yeah.
He did the same thing on July 4. He never told him a thing about the letters he sent to Couch and General Baldy Smith, but he asked them, what would you do? Well, they virtually all said, move on his flank. So he'd already said, move on his flank. It goes to this. Meade once wrote that councils of war are particularly meaningful when all the commanders agree as to the course of action. When they all agree, then you've got everyone in gear to do what they must do. And so, by the way, Meade refers to those councils as consultations. And by the way, he takes that from Meade. That's what Meade called them. And so you can see what a scholar the guy is in the art of war. He is. And he says those were consultations. So, and then of course the famous Council of War down on the Potomac, where he finally gets there. He wants to order an attack on the 13th, and a lot of his subordinates caution him, saying, "There's no way we can prevail in an attack down there." And so he calls it Council of War, and this is one where Meade really calls it, wanting to know the feelings of everyone, given the fact he's already ordered an attack. And the majority, vast majority, save two, say no, don't you dare. And frankly, it was good advice to the general. Lee had fortified the Army of the Potomac, Army of the Northern Virginia, along what's known as Salisbury Ridge between Hagerstown and Falling Water. It's a 9-mile-long broken ridge, but a ridge. To attack that, you would have had to have crossed nearly 1.5 miles of open ground that was only broken by a stream called Marsh Run that then was probably up to your shoulders in depth because of all the rain. Then you would have had to have fought your way through rifle pits all the way to the point where you're below the guns up there. And that ridge was about as well set up for field artillery as any of those experts who looked at it after Lee had evacuated had ever seen. And Meade even confessed before the Committee on the Conduct of the War that had we attacked, we would have been defeated. Right. And a defeat down there, by the way, think of what that would have done to this campaign, where he had just won the largest land battle in the history of this continent, for an army that had never won a battle against its enemy before. And then to lose there, and lose in a horrible way, and that is to have your men just kind of butchered going across those fields. So if you're hearing me say, I'm for George Meade and every one of those councils, you're right. And by the way, I just want to add one other thing. George Meade is clearly a team player. Mm-hmm. He's the type the Army today would love to have in the ranks. Right. A guy who wants everyone on the same page. Mm-hmm. And why wouldn't you be that? You know, you don't sit there and just tell them what to do. You counsel and then say, here's what we're going to do. Right. And then you get them on board. But he's a team player.
I mean, I have to say that my perspective on Meade, through all the time I've spent around the battlefield here, I'm really looking forward to this book because I already have a newfound appreciation for Meade. I always had that pride. There's a Pennsylvanian, I'm a Pennsylvania boy, born and raised, who leads the Army of the Potomac, gets a victory at Gettysburg. But there's always that sense. But now to really appreciate Meade as a scholar of military tactics, and to appreciate the way he led the Army of the Potomac through challenges that I hadn't really considered. The fact that trying to get, like you said, trying to get the horses fed, trying to take care of the supply trains, even getting a message back to DC. Yeah, so often we think Gettysburg's proximity to Baltimore and DC, and we've got all of these roads coming in and out of Gettysburg. But as you mentioned, with Meade having that, trying to get word back to Halleck, you can't send a courier down that road, right? As there's an attack going across it, but there's those challenges. That's like some Orders 191 stuff going on there, you know?
Yeah.
So
it's interesting. People make a great deal out of the high ground. Ron Maxwell in his movie makes a huge deal out of his officers. Oh, we've got the high ground, and of course, high ground is important in an engagement with an enemy. However, high ground in and of itself is not what's needed. There are other aspects to that high ground. Can it be turned on either side? Is it situated at a place that also is dangerous? At Gettysburg, both of those words of caution come into place. The high ground at Cemetery Hill and Culp's Hill is indeed excellent defense positions, as shown by that battle. However, between Cemetery Hill and Little Round Top is very little. And as Winfield Hancock said, echoed by Governor Warren, that where these hills where the Army rests right now are good defensive ground, we're subject to being turned on our left. And the other thing is that the Baltimore Pike runs along the summit of Cemetery Hill and Culp's Hill, or just slightly to the rear of Culp's Hill, which means it could be seized at any moment. So it's kind of tough to have your principal defensive line set up such that some of your guns are even behind the road necessary for you to stay alive.
Yeah.
And making it even more complex. And there were at least 3 different times I found George Meade in the wee hours of July 2nd, either meeting with other generals up on Cemetery Hill or by himself, being heard though, saying, well, I guess this is as good a place to fight a battle as anywhere. Almost a feeling of resignation. Here we are. We're not going to be able to do anything else. It's just as good to fight them here as anywhere else.
Yeah.
He didn't say, oh, wow, this is excellent territory. I'm glad we're here. Nothing like this. Well, it's as good a place to fight a battle as anywhere else.
So we're sadly out of time because well, this will be my plug for our CWI event, is that everyone who's tuned in here can register to attend our virtual CWI Civil War Institute at Gettysburg College Summer 2021 conference, where Kent, you're going to be in conversation with my boss, my advisor, Civil War historian, Dr. Peter Carmichael, who's the director of the Civil War Institute, to talk more about Meade at Gettysburg and the book Meade at Gettysburg, A Study in Command, which is going to be coming out this summer from UNC Press, and I think I am convinced is going to be a must-have for everyone out there who's touring Gettysburg and thinks about what happened on the battlefields here. And I know I look forward to, when I get my copy, to being able to take it around and rethink this, because I've called this place home for 4 years, and after this conversation, I have a new perspective on this place and on Meade and the Army of the Potomac. So I really appreciate you taking the time to chat with me today, and I hope sooner or later we'll be all able to be in person and out on the battlefield together.
Thank you, Cameron, very much.
All right.